The official name of Lightroom is Adobe Photoshop Lightroom. And that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Sometimes we forget that. We forget that Lightroom is part of this Photoshop family and that these tools are really intended to be used together. Here, what I want to do is not teach Lightroom, but just begin to get us to think about how we can use Lightroom and Photoshop together. Now, the nice thing about Lightroom is we can do a number of different things, like we could add keywords to our photographs. We could go to the Develop module. In the Develop module, we could change the overall color temperature. We could modify its tone, the contrast, the clarity. We could create different types of effects with our images. And in this case, I'm going to show the before and after. Here's before and there's after. And so as you can see, we can start to make some really interesting changes to our photographs. Now, again, I'm just barely skimming the surface, but you get the idea. We could also show this as a slideshow, print this image, or put it in an online web gallery. So there's quite a bit that we can do inside of Lightroom, and we'll dig into all of these details. Well, why then would you use Photoshop, or how would this compare to a Photoshop workflow? Well, in Lightroom, it's always going to remember everything we've done. It's a raw workflow, which means we can always undo this, and I'll go ahead and undo this here. So now I've undone everything. You'll also notice that there was no render time. I didn't have to render filters or create new layers or increase the file size. So it's a really quick workflow. Yet there is a point where you're going to want to take an image further. Like, for example, with this particular file, I was interested in creating a little bit more of a conceptual look. I wanted an image which illustrated the experience rather than journalistically showed what was happening. So in that particular situation, what I decided to do was to take it into Photoshop. And here in Photoshop, we can see the image as processed from Lightroom, cleaned it up, clarity, sharpness, noise reduction, etc. And then I started to do things like I retouched this window out. Now you can't do that in Lightroom, not with those type of exact edges. That's one of the limitations of the retouching in Lightroom. And as you can see here, I'll just turn on these layers. I applied a number of different effects in order to modify how the image looked. And again, just looking to try to create a different type of experience. Now the point here isn't that every time you go to Photoshop, you create something this dramatic. Yet I think this is a helpful image to illustrate this idea that in Lightroom, a lot of our work is a little bit broader. Now, a lot of times you finish images in Lightroom. I mean, they look amazing in Lightroom. Yet there are those situations where perhaps you want to take things a little bit further or work on a specific detail or retouch something in a really unique way. And in those situations, you're going to go to the other family member, right? From Lightroom, you go to Photoshop, and then you come back around to Lightroom. So the nice thing about these two programs is that they work together. And I think my intent in this movie is just to begin to get you to think about how they work together and to not drop your Photoshop skills. I meet so many people who say, hey, I only work in Lightroom now. And I can tell. Their images are at about 80% of their potential. And yes, Lightroom, you can go really far, and it's one of the main tools. But if you want to take things even further, you will also need to include Photoshop in your overall workflow.